Imagine an England where the monarch has absolute power. The power of life and death over her subjects, the power to make her own laws, impose her own taxes, declare war and settle peace.
Police!
Imagine an England where most police raids are to arrest writers who dare to criticize the state. Imagine an England where many of the police work for the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Hi there, good morning. Happy Easter.
Imagine an England where not going to church on Sundays is against the law and where religious dissent is an imprisonable offence. Imagine an England where a parliament that opposes the monarch is dismissed. Imagine an England where the monarch has absolute control over the army and uses it against her subjects. That was England 350 years ago. This is the story of our first attempts to change it.
I'm being punished because of the malice and cruelty of the bishops.
They have driven a wedge between the king and his people by introducing altar worship and idolatry into our cathedrals.
This is not justice, this is tyranny!
This is a pretend parliament, a mock parliament. The people in it are traitors to their country.
This is not God's work, this is the devil's work!
Protests like this should be addressed to the king, not to the people. We are not here to please the people.
The poor preserved the kingdom. They risked their lives for it, and now they want their birthright. No!
The Houses of Parliament have changed beyond recognition since Charles I's time. For a start, they burnt down once. Now, through those gates there, that's the car park now, that's New Palace Yard. But it's in there that the Star Chamber stood, a court that was notorious for inflicting brutal punishment on anyone who criticised the king. And on April the 18th, 1638, a young man endured a particularly vicious ordeal in there.
The man's name was John Lilburne. He was 22 and a Puritan. He'd been tied to a cart, dragged for 2 miles, and flogged every 3 paces. His back was torn and bleeding. He was allowed 2 hours' rest before being clamped in the pillory. His crime was to smuggle banned books into the country. John Lilburne was swept along in the religious fervour engulfing the capital. Many feared King Charles was planning to return Protestant England to Catholicism. But pamphlets saying this were banned, like all publications critical of the state. So dissidents had them printed in Holland, and it was on his return from Amsterdam that Lilburne was arrested.
Come on, get him in the pillory. Go back. Back.
John Lilburne was a born propagandist.
God bless you, John.
As he was led to the pillory, he couldn't resist launching another attack on the king's bishops.
Brothers, I have committed no offence against the law of God, nor against the law of the land. I'm being punished because of the malice and cruelty of the bishops. Where do they get their authority, these bishops? I'll tell you where. From the Pope! The Pope's nothing less than the beast of Revelations, the Antichrist, the devil himself. I challenge their lordships to deny this. They can hang me at Tyburn before I stop.
Gag! True! Get me a gag!
Lilburne was imprisoned in Fleet Jail. His hands and feet were chained and visitors forbidden. Lilburne would spend much of his adult life in prison for demanding social justice, religious freedom, and eventually the modern world's first democratic government. But in 1638, England was as far from democracy as one could imagine. England was an absolute monarchy. In 1638, Charles Stuart had been King of England for 13 years. Occasionally, Charles and his wife, Henrietta Maria, dined in public. The idea was to give his subjects a rare glimpse of their ruler. This was the King and Queen on display, the 17th century equivalent of a photo opportunity. Charles believed his kingly authority came directly from God. He was the father of the nation and apex of the church, the law, and the aristocracy. No one questioned King Charles's right to rule, but they were beginning to criticize the way he did so, especially his religious policy. England in Charles's time was strongly Protestant. Many of his subjects were Puritans, fundamentalists who hated ornaments in church, disliked ceremony in services, and disapproved of the Anglican prayer book. On the other hand, Charles and his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, liked beauty in churches, encouraged proper ritual, and demanded strict observance of the prayer book. To many Puritans, this smacked of popery. Some suspected the king was a secret Catholic. In Oathorpe, Nottinghamshire, a group of Puritans were on their way to a nearby church. John Hutchinson, aged 30, was a local squire. His wife was 22-year-old Lucy. Charles and Laud were inspecting the latest additions to the royal programme of church beautification, the newly decorated St. Paul's. But in Oathorpe, there was a crisis.
Good morning, sir.
The priest has locked himself inside.
He has locked himself inside.
The Puritans had heard that the local priest, in line with royal religious policy, had installed stained glass, altar rails and paintings in this church.
The priest here has filled the church with images of Christ on the cross and other superstitious paintings of his own designs. It's an offence to the good people of this village. The priest won't remove them himself and won't allow these people into the church to do it.
They came with whitewash and axes to restore the church to its former plainness. At first, the priest locked himself in the church, but John Hutchinson and his fellow Puritans soon forced their way in.
All must be covered. All must be removed.
These superstitious images show how our Church of England has taken on the whorish behaviour and dress of Rome.
Surely not the sacred image of Christ, our own Redeemer.
The king and the Puritans were now on a collision course. Compounding the problem was the religion of his queen. Henrietta Maria was a French Catholic. Married to Charles for 14 years, she had already borne him 5 children. Henrietta practiced her Catholicism with missionary zeal. She had for a time taken the Prince of Wales to Mass. She had surrounded herself with Catholic courtiers, securing them powerful positions. Even her dwarf, Geoffrey Hudson, was a Catholic. For the first time in years, the Pope's envoy was welcome at the English court. Charles played chess with him and enjoyed his company. The king's subjects were suspicious of the Queen's influence and grew increasingly angry.
She is French, clever and haughty. Some say she's beautiful. The king has fallen completely under her spell and the court has become full of papists, and the king now spends more time with the Pope's envoy than he does with his English advisers. He's become a worse encroacher of civil and spiritual liberties than his father ever was.
But Charles didn't much care what his subjects thought of him. As absolute ruler, he didn't need to.
My lords and members of the House of Commons.
Imagine the Queen with the same powers as King Charles. She would make all decisions of government policy. Parliament would be a feeble institution she could summon and dissolve at will. When the Queen did call a Parliament, the role of MPs would be merely to advise her and, in cases of emergency, approve the taxes she wanted.
Proposals for reform.
But even such a toothless parliament was too much for King Charles. In 1629, he dissolved it and ruled for 10 years without one. When he needed money, he invented controversial taxes. When anyone opposed him, he had them punished by courts like the Star Chamber. But then events in the north forced him to summon a parliament once more.
The Scots had rebelled against Charles's religious policies, and the 2 brief wars that followed were disastrous for the king. Charles now desperately needed money to buy off the Scots. Only the House of Commons could approve the necessary funds. So in 1640, he reluctantly summoned Parliament. The decision would have momentous consequences for him and the future of his kingdoms. How many of today's MPs know that they derive their powers and privileges from the efforts of these men arriving at a parliament 350 years ago? Our MPs tread the same ground as their predecessors, though the building they entered has long since vanished. All MPs arriving at Parliament claim they're on a mission to reform. After 11 years in the wilderness, these men really meant it. Edward Hyde was one of the newly elected members. Clever and a little pleased with himself, he was an up-and-coming lawyer. He would later write a famous history of the Civil War. He was the 3rd son of a rich and well-connected Wiltshire landowner. He was married to Frances, his second wife. Hyde was elected MP for Saltash in Cornwall, though he'd never been there. Like most MPs then, he was chosen by the local gentry because he reflected their views. For all its deficiencies, Parliament offered a platform for opposition to the king's unpopular laws and policies. Hyde's particular concern was the legal system.
I've set aside my practice to devote myself to the House and its business. There are many grievances to be addressed. I intend to speak against the Star Chamber, and I'll seek the abolition of the Court of Chivalry, a court set up without any shadow of law, a court which fines and imprisons citizens at the behest of the rich. Like the poor man who referred to a goose on a gentleman's livery instead of a swan. Or the tailor who, in an argument over a bill, called himself as good a man as his customer. Both men fined and locked up. Oh, there's much to remedy.
As Hyde joined his fellow MPs at Westminster, many of them felt they had been given a rare opportunity. The king needed money, but before they would grant it, he must redress their grievances. The House of Commons lobby. Converted from the former Chapel of St. Stephen's, the building was on the same site as the present House of Commons. As most MPs were new, guides were issued on how to behave. Hyde was soon appointed chairman of several reforming committees.
There's an air of elation. Members are no longer talking about gentle remedies as they were 6 months ago. Now they talk of the cause instead of the cure. It's extraordinary.
A shadowy figure at the time was the new MP for Cambridge, Oliver Cromwell. Aged 40, he arrived in rough country clothes, with blood on his shirt collar. A devout Puritan, Cromwell was obsessive and argumentative. He was soon at odds with Hyde in committee meetings.
He is as rough and ill-mannered as the people he represents. When I chided them for interrupting proceedings, he fell on me in a great fury, accused me of partiality and threatening his witnesses, and when Lord Mandeville tried to speak, Cromwell insulted him too. His language was so indecent and offensive, I had to adjourn the meeting and make a formal complaint about his behaviour. I don't believe he'll ever forgive me. It's not in the man's nature.
56-year-old John Pym emerged as the leader of the opposition to the king. Nicknamed the Ox, he was prepared to stand up to Charles. This took political skill and considerable courage. Opponents of 17th century kings often risked prison and even death.
I think Mr. Pym is the most popular member in this parliament. Certainly the most experienced. He's served in many parliaments and his knowledge of procedure is greatly respected. He's inclined to the Puritan party. Expresses himself very well. Grave with a wonderful fluency. His success comes from hard work, I think, rather than any natural gifts. He began as a clerk in the Exchequer. He's a very private man, but does many good offices for people. Of all the members, I consider him to have the greatest understanding of the mood of the country. He's also very shrewd. Very shrewd indeed.
A fervent Puritan, Pym wanted change, and wanted it fast.
Well, this Parliament must be of a different temper than the last. We must not only sweep the house clean below, we must pull down the cobwebs from the top and from the corners. They have hung there too long, breeding dust and making the house foul. We now have the opportunity to make this country happy by removing all grievances and pulling the causes of them up by the roots. We all have a duty to this.
Pym's main grievance was the conduct of the king's two chief advisers, the Earl of Strafford and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Both were hated for carrying out the king's unpopular policies. Laud was outspoken in his criticism of Puritans.
We must steer our church through a middle way between superstitious tyranny and eccentric anarchy. Puritans are like wolves. They should be held by the ears.
Strafford was the king's enforcer, and his advice was typically uncompromising.
If Parliament refuses to supply the king with funds in the usual way, the king must provide for the safety of the kingdom however he sees fit. The welfare of the realm is the supreme law.
Unfortunately for Charles, it wasn't just MPs who hated Laud and Strafford. London's large Puritan population regularly demonstrated against them. The parliamentary debates of 1641 took place in this highly charged atmosphere. John Pym exploited this. He persuaded fellow MPs to extract concessions from the king before granting him the taxes he wanted. Reluctantly, Charles gave in. He agreed to abolish the Star Chamber. He gave up his right to dissolve Parliament. He repealed the taxes he had imposed without Parliament's consent. Most MPs felt they were getting what they wanted. But Pym wanted more. He was convinced that Charles and his closest advisers were conspiring to return the country to Catholicism. Pym and his supporters did not let up their attack.
There is a plan to change the religion of this kingdom and its government. This plan, which has been edging forward step by step, is now striding towards its goal. We must take action. We must move now for a complete reformation, finding out those responsible and punishing them.
Pym forced Charles to sacrifice his closest allies. First, the Earl of Strafford was arrested, condemned by Act of Parliament, and sent to the block. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury was sent to the Tower. He too would die on the scaffold. With these sacrifices, the crisis seemed to be over. But Charles's kingdom was about to change beyond recognition.